orchards can play in supporting many species from insects to bats is going to tell us why they can be so important and what wildlife might be found there. So over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Hannah. Right, I'm just going to share my screen. So bear with me just for a few seconds. Okay, hopefully you can all see that okay. Here we go.
Yeah.
Right, great, perfect. Okay, so yeah, so as Hannah was saying, I'm Anna, and I've been working for Devon Wildlife Trust since late 2015, which has gone very fast. But I've been working for various wildlife trusts actually across the country since 2011. So when I was thinking about that earlier, I was like, wow, that's a whole decade, which I was, yeah, quite surprised by. So thank you all for coming along to the talk. And I do realise this isn't the only sort of big cultural event going on at the moment. And you might every now and then hear noises in the background because I am right next to the Bishop Blaise pub. So I'm giving this talk from Pricklepit Mill. So every now and then you might hear some shouting. So if you're wondering about the score, you'll know, I'm sure, if there is a score, because you'll hear the noises. So yeah, so I'm going to sort of go through this talk, and it aims to look at what makes orchards sort of such a brilliant habitat really for wildlife, their connection with Devon in particular, the wildlife that thrives in the habitat, and what the future outlook for orchards is in the county and the country. And also some handy tips if you're lucky enough to maybe own an orchard or have like an orchard area in your garden, or if you are involved in a community orchard or have a say in orchards in general. Yeah, so I'll make a bit of a start, and any questions I think you can type them in, and then I'll aim to sort of answer them at the end. So what is an orchard? So that might seem like a silly question, but there are sort of two sort of types of orchard, if you like, that we find. So we have the sort of the traditional orchard, which is what you probably think of when you think of an orchard, and these are the quite widely spaced, usually sort of 8 to 10 meter spacings of trees with nice bit of grassland underneath. It's all quite low intensity management, not very many pesticides or chemicals or anything like that, so lots of insect life. And in Devon particularly, often it's apples because there's a big history of cider making in the area, but also we have sort of cherries and plums and things like that too, and increasingly sort of nuts as well. So the traditional orchards, but there are also these more modern sort of intensive versions of orchards, which are known as the bush orchards. And I always think of the bush orchards when I'm going up on the M5, and in Somerset there are just rows upon rows of them. And so that's a really different kettle of fish altogether, and not nearly as beneficial to wildlife. So we're really focusing on the sort of traditional orchards that you sort of think of really when you think of an orchard. And I think they're quite a sort of romantic feature of the landscape really, and remind us of a type of agriculture and life which is now largely ended. And they sort of, yeah, they're quite a nostalgic habitat, I think, and really lovely to be in and walking around, because they're always in a state of flux. So in the spring, you know, you've got the beautiful blossoms out, and then fruits are always ripening and getting bigger during the summer. And then the autumn, when they're ready for harvest, it's all quite exciting. And then in the winter, there's sort of fruits on the floor, and you get sort of flocks of thrushes and, yeah, different winter species. So it seems like orchards are always changing. There's always something else to see. I know that's the same for a lot of habitats, but it seems especially so with an orchard. So there is a lot that can be said about orchards, and perhaps they sort of don't seem like they should be the richest wildlife habitat that we have, but I actually think that they really are. And it is in fact quite possible to get pretty nerdy about orchards and their sort of similarity to how our landscape used to look like before modern agriculture and sort of modern humans really took hold. And in fact, many paleo-ecologists, or people who study what the landscape used to look like before we sort of dominated it completely, I suppose, believe that rather than a prehistoric wildwood, so that would be like a closed canopy woodland across the whole of the country, our landscape would have been much more dynamic, and herds of herbivores maintaining and creating a more sort of wood pasture type environment would have been the dominant type of habitat in many locations. And this particular kind of habitat, which we would have expected to have seen in the past, is not at all dissimilar to a traditional orchard, which we still find remnants of today in Devon. And it is sobering to think that since the 19th century, we have lost up to about 90% of traditional orchards in our county. So the lights are all just turning off around me. So I might just do a little wave to try and switch them back on. But if it's not a problem, I'll carry on. I'll just be a bit darker. Yeah, so it is a habitat that, yes, it's man-made, but actually it really mimics the sorts of habitats that our wildlife in Britain would have evolved alongside. And so it's little wonder that orchards are actually one of the habitats that can host the most wildlife of any habitat that we find in our beautiful county and across the country. So what are these environmental benefits of orchards? And what makes them so great? So I've discussed, the history of them and how that is a big part of it. But it's the habitat structure in an orchard that's really key to being brilliant for wildlife. And one thing that people don't necessarily think about a lot is that fruit trees are what's known as early senescent, which is they get old quickly, which isn't what you want as a human, but as a tree, that's brilliant because they become what's known as a veteran tree really quickly. So whereas you'd expect an old oak tree to have to be 400 years old or so before it really develops some of these brilliant features that are so good for our wildlife, so bits of deadwood habitat, holes and fissures and nice bits of fungi and lichen and all that kind of thing, it can actually take an apple tree much less than 100 years to get to that stage. And so that makes this habitat even better because it's much more full of these sort of veteran tree type habitats, which are going to be benefiting all kinds of invertebrates and birds and bats and fungi and just anything really that's the basis of the food chain. The other thing as well about it is that the structure actually creates lots of habitat niches in itself. So if you were to just have potentially a wildflower meadow, which we all know is a brilliant habitat, you're only going to have quite a 2D habitat in any one time. But if you also have an orchard in that meadow, then you've just created an incredible extra bit of habitat in the same geographic space. So not only have you got your meadow and all the benefits from that, but you've also got all these different niches for nesting birds, roosting bats, different sorts of fungi, and just perches for all kinds of different species. So you've got many habitats in one. But it does need to be managed in a very low intensity way. So managing the meadow as a meadow or maybe just low levels of grazing is perfect. And then just being really sort of careful with the trees as well. So only pruning back dead wood when it's necessary and that kind of thing all helps to make it perfect as a habitat for wildlife. And the other thing is where you get quite a lot of in orchards is the mistletoe, which is a hemiparasitic plant. And mistletoe actually has just alone has 6 invertebrates that are reliant on it, and including the mistletoe marble moth, which I'll show you a picture of in a bit. And so orchards are recognised as a priority habitat in the UK, and technically farmers and land managers can get some funding towards managing them, but it's actually in reality quite hard to access that funding. So orchards in Devon. So the history of Devon and the history of orchards, and in particular cider orchards, are really intertwined, as I'm sure many of you are aware of. And in the 19th century, and I actually didn't know this until I was sort of doing a bit of extra research for this talk, Devon had the biggest area of orchards of any county in the UK. I mean, it does help that Devon is one of the biggest counties in the UK, but nevertheless, like it just does really show that Devon was covered in orchards. And in fact, it was estimated about 23,000 acres of orchards existed in the 19th century, which is a huge amount. And I thought it'd be really nice to kind of pick out a little area. So this is Buckfastleigh in this picture, and this is a map from sort of about 1860, I think. And I found this on oldmaps.co.uk. If you've never been onto oldmaps.co.uk, then you're about to lose hours of your life because it's so fun just kind of going through and looking at all the places that you know in Devon or anywhere in the country. And you can go back to see the OS maps for them for back to the 1860s. Right up to the modern day, and you can really see the changes in the landscape, and sometimes it's quite shocking. And so you can see here all the extent to which orchards are really widespread in Buckfastleigh. And now you can see how it is now. So I'll just go through again. So we didn't even have the A38, it was just the Buckfastleigh station, which you can still see in the middle here. But all of the orchards have either been turned into development, or they're sort of falling into this neglect. There's a few bits of orchard left here, but that's it from what was maybe 40 to 50% of this bit of landscape. There's now nothing. So that is just a little indicator of the extent that orchards used to cover, and now the extent to which we have lost quite a few. So in the 19th century, they were hugely important as a, not just for wildlife, but for people, and people really relied on orchards for some of their income. And it's worth noting that the impact of trade policy in the UK is not a recent thing. So there's a lot in the news at the moment about the EU and the Common Agricultural Policy and Brexit implications. But these are just the most recent ways in which policies and politics have kind of played a part in the makeup of our landscape, and farmers and producers have had to respond to these different changes in trade blockades or taxes and other policies. And so, for instance, an increase in the 18th and 19th centuries of orchards in Devon and across the country was in part due to the Napoleonic Wars, meaning that trade blockades on importing what was often considered in those days to be superior cider from Normandy was really restricted during the Napoleonic Wars. And so the price of apples increased in the UK, and so more orchards were planted. So many of our remnant old orchards that we see really old orchard trees in are a remnant of this time, actually, when the 19th century sort of Napoleonic Wars were playing a part in how our landscape looked, which I think is pretty cool. But yeah, so it's good to kind of think about, that sort of long-term context and why orchards were really popular. So we know that orchards now have really declined, and by this figure of about 90%. And so there are various things that we're all trying to do to bring them back, I suppose. So I thought it'd be nice to have a little look at this case study of some of the work that we have been undertaking as a part of, in this case, the Greater Horseshoe Bat Project. So in this picture, you can see this is actually called Hatch's Farm, which is a really beautiful farm in Gunners Lake, just outside Gunners Lake, over the Tamar. And you can see here in this picture, there are a few old apple trees. This is all that's left of this orchard when we first turned up here. And then in this picture over on the right, this is a picture taken in the late 1800s. And in this red circled is actually the orchard. It's the same place. And this picture is taken from a place called Chimney Rock, which is way up high here. So it looks like it's taken by a drone or something, but it was the 1800s, so it definitely wasn't. But you can see that the orchard here, even though it's not very clear, was covered in trees, and it was obviously a thriving orchard. And these are all that's left of these trees. And so we decided that we would try and restore the orchard, because this was in the area where greater horseshoe bats are hunting, and orchards are a brilliant habitat for greater horseshoe bats, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But we managed to really pull together lots of interesting things about orchards, and quite happily we managed to get an expert from Coteal Mother Orchard, which is a National Trust property just over the Tamar. And if you haven't been to see the Mother Orchard at National Trust Coteal, then I really encourage you to do so, because it's amazing. And they have all these different varieties of orchard trees that are very local and maybe don't actually grow anywhere else. So it's brilliant. So we managed to get someone to come and identify what varieties were left in this particular orchard and what type of apples they were. And it was a great day. The guy came over, he was called Chris, and he was tasting the apples, looking at the apples, and managed to note down, like, which varieties there were, and lots of local varieties that are just actually only found in the Tamar Valley, and some that are only found in Devon and Cornwall. But there were 2 or 3 trees in this orchard that he actually couldn't identify, and he suspected that actually they're not recorded anywhere else. I mean, you can make your own assumptions about whether that means that they're just not very tasty apples or not, but nonetheless, that genetic diversity was being lost. And so what we decided we'd do, with the help of our BatWorks funding, which is how we have been able to work with a lot of farmers across our project areas through the BAT project, was we managed to take some cuttings and then work with a local nursery called Ensley, not the one in Ivybridge, which is massive, but a little one in Milton Abbot, which is just up the road from here. And we managed to grow on these cuttings from some of these trees that might be the last ones of their kind. And then we put them on M25 rootstocks, which are a really good rootstock for this sort of orchard and grow really nice and quickly, which means that actually they're less likely to get canker in a quite wet climate. And we planted them into the orchard again, and we managed to plant over 60 separate trees with the help of volunteers. So here we go, we've got a lovely picture of a couple of volunteers putting in one of these apple trees, and then we put these sort of wooden and sort of mesh cages around them to protect them from the grazing livestock in the field, because it's grazed by sheep. So this was really successful. We've managed to restore at least most of the orchard in this site, and when I last went back, most of the trees had survived as well, because the last couple of summers have been quite droughty, I think it's safe to say. So there were a few trees that were lost, but the landowner had agreed to replace them. So yes, so it's been a great success, and I just thought it'd be quite nice to highlight that, because if you are thinking about restoring an orchard, if you're lucky enough to have an orchard, or if you know someone who does, then really do think about trying to identify what those apple trees might be, because they might actually have quite unique properties. And if you manage to work with a local garden nursery as well, then they should be able to do the cuttings and the grafting, or you might be able to do that yourselves. But yeah, certainly trying to preserve some of these old varieties that are unique to this part of the world is really important. Sorry. Yeah, so we did this about 17 times. I mean, the one at Hatches was probably the most intense one, but here on the left hand side, this was an orchard near Buckfast Lee, and this is again planted by volunteers. So this was on land owned by the Camp Hill community at Hatches at Hapstead Farm, and that is a centre for people with learning difficulties and special needs. So it was really great that we were able to bring together volunteers and people who wouldn't otherwise maybe get to do this sort of thing and be involved in this kind of project. So it's really great, and it has become very clear that there's a large appetite out there in the sort of wider Devon landscape for planting orchards and really working with orchards, because people love the habitat. There's a lot of singing going on from the pub, so I don't know, maybe someone scored a goal, I'm not sure. Yeah, and so this is just another picture here of some of the other sort of handiwork of people creating orchards. I like this photo just because the cages made by sort of the craftsmen who owned the site were really beautiful, but I don't think that photo does it that much justice. So Devon is clearly perfect for orchards, and orchards have an important role in the future of agriculture, as they do form part of what's known as this kind of regenerative agriculture push, which is currently in progress. So there is an ambition to get 10% of the UK's farmland into what's known as agroforestry. And agroforestry is a term that's been bandied about a lot recently, but basically all it is involving trees into agricultural land. And so orchards are one of the oldest forms of agroforestry. And so if there is an ambition which has been recommended to the UK government, and they are trying to push forward, partly to do with tree planting and carbon sequestration, then 10% is a huge amount of land and some of that will definitely be orchards. So this isn't just something from the past that we are trying to preserve in the present day because of the wildlife habitat and the cultural habitat. So it's not like a museum piece, but this kind of idea of orchards and trees in the landscape is actually going to be a really important thing for the future as well. And I thought it'd be quite nice to include this picture here. This is one I took just a couple of weeks ago. A lot of cows in a field that were all kind of gathering around the trees and licking the trees. So not only are trees in the landscape in the sort of agricultural context really important for wildlife, but it's actually really great because it provides a lot of nutrients for livestock too. Yeah, I mean, it's not ideal for the tree. I think this tree had been through a lot, really. But it's just interesting to think about the sorts of nutrients that are provided for livestock as well. So it is a welfare thing as well. Some of you might have seen this article that was in The Guardian recently, and it was all about agroforestry and how in Devon a lot of farms are sort of looking into the role of agroforestry and reintroducing trees back into the landscape. And again, some of this won't be orchards, but it is mimicking that kind of orchard habitat, which is really great for wildlife because of all that structure. And so that brings me back into the realm of bats, which if some of you have seen me talk before, I've usually just been talking about bats mainly, but greater horseshoes in particular, they need the sort of structure in a landscape that orchards can offer, because they need to echolocate off structures, and orchard trees provide that perfect structure. So if you had just an open field, even if it was a meadow, that field might be actually inaccessible to greater horseshoe bats. So all the insect life will be happy there without the threat of being predated upon by greater horseshoe bats. But if you put trees into it, then that means that there's structure. The bats will be able to echolocate around, hang off the branches, perch feed, so they'll be able to hang off a branch like in this illustration, and they'll be able to just swoop down, maybe pick up a dung beetle or a moth, just like they're doing here, which is an amazing photo, and crunch them up with their huge teeth. So yeah, the greater horseshoe bat skull is something that's quite terrifying, really. It's lucky it's very small. So yeah, so it's perfect in the respect that it creates a huge amount of structure. And whenever I'm out talking to farmers out on site, I'm always banging on about structure in the landscape, because it's great having wildflower meadows and things that you've got on the ground, but you really want to create as many different niches as possible to make sure that you've catered for as much wildlife as possible. And once you've got spaces for insects, so if you've got nice bits of long grass, you've got areas where you're making sure that you're leaving uncut every year so that insects can complete life cycles, then you're going to be supporting everything else higher up in the food chain. So greater horseshoe bats and lesser horseshoe bats are going to benefit from this because of their, they've got quite weak echolocation abilities, but also other bats, which sort of will be roosting in crevices and underneath bark and in holes in trees, which, as we've discussed, the apple trees in particular, but also other fruit trees, they get old fast, so they produce these brilliant habitats. Then they will be able to get in there and roost in the crannies and the nooks, and they'll be creating perfect habitats too, right next to where all the insect life is. But if you have an orchard, or if you have a nearby orchard, you could suggest this to the owner. Then if it's quite a young orchard still, then putting up bat boxes and bird boxes as well, like quite high up, is going to be helping along. So before the trees get old enough to produce those habitats themselves, then putting up bat boxes is going to be a really beneficial thing to do. Birds in orchards. So I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that birds just really love the fruit that grow in orchards. I thought I'd include this one here. I think it's a female blackbird with a cherry. Yeah, so sometimes it's easy to think of birds as pests in orchard settings, but it's actually a brilliant resource for them when you think about all the hedges that get trimmed every year. The fruit that's provided on orchard trees is incredible. And there are various birds that really thrive. So for instance, goldfinches seem to be particularly fond of nesting in apple trees. So look out for those if you're in orchards in the spring. Fallen apples left after the bumper harvest in orchards are going to be attracting in often really large flocks of thrushes. So this fieldfare, for example, making good use of all these apples. And also the deadwood habitat too on the trees. And I've spoken about the deadwood quite a bit, but it's so important for attracting in more invertebrates and fungi and lichens and all these different things. And then that in turn is going to be providing a food source for things like this lesser spotted woodpecker. So there's just so many things that are going to benefit. I can't really think of very many species of wildlife that wouldn't really enjoy being in an orchard, including humans, of course. And yeah, so many bird species enjoy that sort of habitat complexity that's presented to them, just like the bats do. And it's mimicking that sort of woodland edge habitat too. So if you think about the sorts of birds that you'll be finding in a woodland edge and sort of big bushy hedges and things, like yellowhammers, for example, and other farmland birds, then the similar sorts of species are going to be thriving in an orchard because it is sort of mimicking that woodland edge type habitat. And woodland edges and edge areas is the is sort of greater than the sum of its parts. So it's really bringing together all these brilliant habitats. So insects in orchards. So, oh, I think England's just scored. I don't know if any of you really mind about that, but there's a lot of people seem to mind outside. I'll just let that moment pass. So as you have probably gathered, insect life is the insect life is a traditionally managed orchard can host. Sorry, I'm so distracted now. Well, basically, so as you probably gathered, if you're managing an orchard in a traditional manner, so that would be taking a meadow cut as late as you can, sort of September time, ideally, removing the cuttings, making sure that there are areas of grass that are always left uncut, whether that's around the base of the trees, around the edges, anywhere really, because these areas are properly, refuges for insects that need to overwinter in the grass. But there are other insects too that you want to be attracting in. So, for example, red mason bees, and they like to sort of get right into like lay their eggs and dwell in those little cracks in the fissures and the bits of dead wood and bits of old masonry in south-facing areas. If you can get in some of these red mason bees here, then you will really be improving your chances of a good pollination rate. So the red mason bees earlier on in the season, they can pollinate when loads of other species will just be like, hunkering down because it's raining or whatever. So creating habitat for those species is something that's a really useful thing to do. Cockchafers as well. So this is the cockchafer about to take off. Often considered a pest really in orchards, but the cockchafer population has really crashed. And they are such a key species for greater horseshoe bats, for example. Again, it's that woodland edge type habitat. So they need to eat the leaves of trees when they're an adult, but they need to have like permanent grassland, like you would find underneath an orchard for most of their lives when they are a larvae for the first few years of their lives. So it provides all of these different things that are needed by insects to complete their life cycles. And the thing that's probably the most obvious is, later on in the autumn, late summer, we can see lots of different, especially the red admirals, they come out in their droves and seem to get drunk on the fallen plums and apples and things. I mean, obviously the wasps do that too, but it's really nice to be able to attract in these different butterflies and some of these species that you wouldn't necessarily see. So it really does attract in insects in their droves. So as long as there's a good amount of grassland underneath the trees, there's deadwood in the trees, it's not overly pruned, you can leave piles of wood, so anything that is pruned, creating hibernacular sites. It's going to be good for other things like slow worms and hedgehogs and stuff too, but that's going to be providing even more habitat for insects as well. And grazing as well. So grazing livestock seems to get a lot of bashing in the press, but actually in terms of benefiting wildlife, really quite low intensity grazing is brilliant. So if you do have the ability, or if you know someone who's got an orchard and they don't know whether to have a bit of sheep grazing every now and then, it's actually really great because that dung resource that it brings in is really beneficial. So things like yellow dung flies, so lesser horseshoe bats, that's one of their favorite foods, and the dung beetles as well, really important for all kinds of different bird species, but greater horseshoe bats and the nocturnal bats and ceratines and things too. So you will just be providing an extra element to that resource. But a lot of people, so maybe you've got a few orchard trees in your garden, probably won't want to introduce sheep or small young cows, because it's probably not the most appropriate thing to do. So it's just a case of making sure that you're not mowing the grass underneath the orchard trees all the time, because that you need that nice high amounts of grassland and for the wildflowers to be flowering, and so the pollination is there. So the management of the grassland is really key. Well, the crowd is really loving this match, to say. So there is a really brilliant and friendly network of community orchards across Devon. So I'm not sure if you might be familiar with some of these. So the two largest ones are Orchard Link and Orchard Live. And Orchard Link is mainly based in South Devon, Orchards Live is mainly based in North Devon. So depending on where you live, depends on what you might be most interested in. And you can go on their websites, and it's really great because you can attend courses, hire equipment, visit sites, and sell surplus apples through their websites. And through our DWT advisory officers as well, we are often able to provide free advice to landowners on managing habitats for wildlife. So currently we have projects in a number of catchments, so funded projects where we have advisors out on the ground. You can go out and talk to people about, what habitats they might have. So the dart and the X and the tamer and the torrid, to name a few. And we've also recently started a branch of this advisory service for landowners who aren't in project funded areas, where we can provide tailored advice, say for orchards and other habitats. But for that, we also need to make a small charge just to cover costs because they're not in funded areas. So if you are interested in one-to-one advice, then you might think about contacting DWT, and hopefully you're in one of our project areas. I don't know what's just happened. Someone else has just scored. But I would say definitely go check out these Orchard Live and Orchard Link pages, because if you just want to find out a bit more about orchard pruning and the sorts of orchards that are in your area, so community orchards, for example, then it's a really great resource out there to go and meet other sort of like-minded community orchard fans. And who knows what wildlife you might find when you're out there. So some really key points then, and this is actually my final slide, so it is a bit shorter than was sort of anticipated. The key points for orchard management for wildlife really are just making sure that there's no chemical usage on the site, and there's no sort of artificial fertilizers and reseeding and ploughing and all of that kind of thing, because it's so great that it's this habitat that is very low intensity. So leaving dead wood in situ where possible, and piling up branches that have been piled in situ too as high vernacular, really key. Leaving long areas of grass all year round as first insect refuges. So for instance, in this picture here, this is a campsite actually in Wales where I was at recently, and they had an orchard on site, and it was brilliant the way that they managed it, because it looked really beautiful, but they were also leaving lovely areas of long grass. So you could walk amongst the trees no problem and didn't have to worry about ticks and all that kind of thing. But there were still these great areas where insects would be able to thrive. So I just thought it would be quite a nice illustration of something that might be achievable sort of in a garden setting. And then leaving patches like this for a year or so. So things like the small mammals, that the larger raptors and things that you might find coming into your orchard sometimes will be able to predate. As well as, it's providing those refuge habitats for insects. And then if you've only got quite young trees, so a little bit like these ones are still quite young, then definitely consider putting up things like bat boxes and bird boxes. And then where practical, introducing grazing is really great for wildlife, because you're introducing the dung and you're creating more sort of interesting niches in the grassland. And the dung habitat is going to be really beneficial. I do actually give a whole different talk about the impacts of certain wormers on grazing animals. So it's really, you might be able to find that still actually on the YouTube page. So if you do have livestock, so it is worth thinking about what wormers you're using. For instance, the ivermectins, quite famous because they are particularly a powerful insecticide, and they are sort of about 90% of that just gets passed straight out into the dung, and that's quite a powerful insecticide going out into the landscape and killing insects, because that's, it's an insecticide. So trying to reduce the use of wormers wherever possible is really important, and you can talk to vets about using something called fecal egg counts, and so trying to work out whether you actually need to use wormers in the first place, and then having a little chat with the vets about what might be the least impactful wormer on the environment too. Joining a local orchard group for training and advice is always a really great thing to do, because it makes it quite fun as well. And also making sure that nighttime lighting is kept away from the orchard. So if you have security lights or any kind of lighting at night is problematic for wildlife, and it's famously so for bats, but actually there's loads of evidence about how lighting really detrimentally impacts insects as well, because they rely on the moon and different ways of knowing about when they should come out and when they should hatch out, and all these different things that they take cues from like day length and things like that. It all gets messed up quite quite badly by excessive use of light. So making sure that orchards are dark at night is really important. So those are the sort of key things really about orchard management and what makes them great for wildlife. But the main message really is that they are an incredible habitat for wildlife, and I don't think they get nearly enough praise for it or recognition really, because we do talk a lot about wildflower meadows and we talk a lot about woodlands and how important those habitats are. But this combination of the two brought together is that, you know, the whole is greater than the sum of the two parts, I think. And I think England have just scored another goal. So on that note, I shall finish the presentation and hand back to Hannah. And I'll be here for any questions.
Thank you, Anna. That was an amazing talk. I'm sorry you've had to put up with the football fans cheering.
I don't know what the score even is, but I think England are winning. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it sounds like it, doesn't it? But anyway, that was an amazing talk. And I've learnt so much. I think everyone should have to listen to a talk about orchards just because they're so amazing for wildlife.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'll get through a few of the questions that we've had. So someone's asked, are there more community orchards being created, and can parish councils help with this? Do you know?
Wow. I'm not sure. I would hope so, because they're a great thing. I know that in South Devon there was a lot of funding that ended in the last few years for sort of community orchards, and I would hope that there will be more funding coming up, but I'm not personally familiar with what schemes there might be in various parish councils. But there are often grants from, for example, like the Woodland Trust. So if you look on their website and if you try and contact a sort of a local representative from the Woodland Trust through their website, then they often have packs for communities, and sometimes they have fruit tree packs, and they're definitely kind of pushing the agroforestry aspect of it too. So that might be quite a good path to try. I know that DWT will be starting with a few more community members of staff soon, so that's probably something to, yeah, once the new community team gets all up and running, then that might be something that they can start looking at too. But yes, I'm not sure how that might work at the moment, but yeah, I'm sure there's scope for it in the future. But it's great to hear that you're interested in doing that.
Great, thank you. How long would it take for an orchard to grow if you were starting from scratch?
Well, I mean, it's like, you know, like I was saying with the apple trees, for example, they do get quite old quite quickly, and it depends on the type you're growing and the rootstock you're using, and what the grass underneath is like. But I would say it is quite quick to produce a habitat that looks like it's quite a nice structured habitat. So yes, if you buy trees that are 2 or 3 years old, for example, it doesn't take that long for them to start to produce a few fruit, but it's not going to be a massive tree very, very quickly. But yeah, I mean, they are trees, so it's going to take you maybe, it depends what you think is the finished product, I suppose. So even a young orchard is going to be providing some of those brilliant benefits. You know, some places where you can expect birds might be able to nest within a few years. If you can put back boxes up once they're sturdy enough, and that's going to be providing that habitat, and making sure that you're managing the grasslands underneath in a beneficial way too, because orchards aren't just the trees, they're the whole habitat. So just thinking about what grassland species you already have as well, and then looking at whether you want to enhance the grassland underneath. So I didn't really talk about that sort of aspect of it, but that is something that you could probably just think about, how to create a wildflower meadow and then planting an orchard on that, if you like. So those two habitats are sort of slightly different but in the same place. But it is, yeah, 3 or 4 years and you'll be able to have something that definitely looks like an orchard, but you'll continue to mature, of course, but that's part of the fun. So
yeah. And a question that's just kind of occurred to me along those lines is that I'm assuming as Devon had so many orchards that they don't mind which type of soil they're planted in, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I don't think they're particularly fussy. Someone might correct me, but I've seen orchards in every sort of habitat really. So they seem to go in really steep bits of land, kind of quite fertile areas. So yeah, I wouldn't know actually if there is a particular preference for them.
Yeah, okay.
And again, if it's quite sort of heavy soils, then it is probably something worth thinking about stocking densities and that kind of thing, and livestock, because it might cause quite a lot of compaction in the ground. But yeah, in terms of the actual how the trees will grow, I think it's okay as long as there's enough soil for them to take hold in. You might need to do a soil test, and if there's not much nutrients, then you can add some manure and things when you're planting them. But yeah, their roots go really deep, so they'll be able to pull up a lot of nutrients once they're established.
Great. And someone's just let us know that the Queen's Jubilee Canopy funding can be used for fruit trees, apparently.
Oh wow,
So
okay.
that might be something that people could have a look at. I don't know much about that, so I shall look up that as well. Are wildlife friendly orchards as productive as those that you showed us at the beginning that were more intensive?
Well, I guess not. But well, actually, having said that, they probably are. But the reason why the new orchards are set up like that is because it's easier to harvest them. So if you think about the sort of manpower that's involved in picking fruit from a proper sized tree, that would involve going up on ladders, and if you're trying to shake the apples down, then you're risking creating bruising, and then that has implications for the cider making process and all that kind of stuff. So the way that the new orchards are set up is that it's much easier to harvest them quickly and with machinery. But actually the productivity, when you think about it, it's probably not that dissimilar, especially when you consider that some of these trees are going to be a lot older and a lot bigger, and so actually per tree it's going to be very different. But yeah, I mean, the whole way that the modern agriculture set up is about ease, really, isn't it? So yeah, so a lot of the older systems aren't necessarily less productive at all. It's just that it involves more manpower, and it's less simple, and it's not as straightforward.
Okay. And do you know, could people grow apple or other orchard type trees in pots at home? Is there ways that they can grow them in the garden?
Yes, yeah, I was thinking about doing a whole bit about that, but I decided against it just because I thought I'd just do general principles for all of it. But yeah, there's so many things that you can do in even a small space in your garden. So there's all kinds of varieties and rootstocks as well. So I sort of mentioned the M25 rootstock, which is what we've been using on our restoration projects in Devon. And that's because it grows really quickly, and that somehow sort of outspeeds the canker. But you can get all these other sorts of like dwarfing fruit varieties that you can just have like stepovers, or you can grow them as espaliers and all this kind of stuff. So that is going to be also providing some of the same benefits that the orchards, that the traditional orchards do provide, the early nectar sources and the source of fruit for birds, and also just areas that you can keep a bit more wild at the foot of the tree, for example. So yes, there's everything in and more that you can imagine that you can buy in terms of fruits. But I would just say be careful of where you buy them, because it's probably better to buy from a local producer who knows what sort of habitat the climate of Devon, because there are certain fruit trees that don't do so well in our climate because it is a bit wetter. So if you try and choose like a local nursery that we often use something called Adam's apples. They're really great. They sell lots of local varieties, and for example, the Ensley Nursery at Milton Abbott, they've got all these varieties that are so specific to where we live that is much less chance that they would die of canker in the first few years. So it's worth just having a little look around to see what you can find.
Okay. If you were setting up an orchard, would it be beneficial for the wildlife to mix up the type of fruit trees, or I think you mentioned nuts?
Yeah, definitely. So you get different fruits will be lasting for different amounts of time, and so especially if you're able to leave some of the fruit on the ground, so some apples will store for longer, some apples will mature later, and some will mature earlier, so you're going to have a fruit source throughout the whole year. But then also plums and nuts and all kinds of things. So I think as well, thinking about it more as orchards are a great thing because of the structure. So whatever trees you're growing, it's still contributing to that kind of idea that you're creating this sort of parkland type habitat, which is what a lot of our wildlife has evolved alongside, and you're recreating this sort of woodland edge type matrix. So whether you decide to plant in even walnut trees or almond trees or any kind of trees that you think might actually do really well, given that climate change is going to change how our weather systems will work. And so you might think, well, whatever's doing well in northern France, for example, then you can give that a go. So I think it's a case of not trying to do something just because it was the traditional thing. So you might not want to grow cider apples, for example, if you're not keen on making cider. But don't think that just because you're not growing something that was traditionally grown in Devon, it won't be providing loads of wildlife benefits, because it's that structure really that is providing that.
Great. Someone said, if you do get canker, is there anything you can do about it?
I don't know. I think you'd have to talk to someone who's a bit of a pruning expert about that one. I know that there are things that you can do and you can try and prune it out and this sort of stuff, but I wouldn't like to say, yeah, how you would go about doing it. Yeah,
Okay.
I know it's a bit of an issue.
Yeah, so at the beginning, I think you'd put a picture of a blackbird, was it, eating a cherry, which obviously some people might think of as a pest because the birds get there first. But in general, would you try and encourage birds into orchard? Because are they good at predating kind of possible pests? You know, if you're growing it for agroforestry and, you know, trying to make a living out of growing an orchard, is that something that would be good to do?
Yeah, well, it's all about what you're trying to get out of it, isn't it? So if you're if part of your aim is that you want to create a great habitat, then you might sacrifice a few trees and say, actually, this is what you know, you're going to leave it for wildlife. But if your aim is that you're creating a commercial orchard, then it's very different, isn't it? And you want to try and minimize that damage. But definitely a lot of birds will be eating things like, you know, picking off aphids and picking out invertebrates that might be damaging. And the bats in particular will be taking out things like, you know, some of the codling moths and what have you. So it is, you're creating a whole ecosystem really. So you're going to have things that are beneficial and things that aren't so beneficial, but if you've got a good balanced habitat, then it shouldn't ever get too out of control. But yeah, I mean, the cherries, like, it's quite rare that you manage to have a tree full of cherries by the end of the season, isn't it? So, you know, I think if that is really the aim and you want to get loads of cherries off the tree, then you might need to consider netting or, yeah, something that's going to prevent birds from actually eating them all, unfortunately. But yeah.
So you can get a good ecological system going rather than, say, using a spray or something. You know, doing it more naturally can be done.
Yeah. Well, and there was an interesting study about the impact of bats on I think it was almond orchards in California, and they were worth it was millions and millions of dollars in terms of their predation, because they were the presence of the bats basically meant that they could reduce the numbers of pesticides they used to kill off the moths, because the bats were eating so many of the moths that would otherwise have been causing problems for the harvest. So yeah, there's lots of evidence across the world about how different predators in a system can really reduce the impacts of insect predation in particular. And there's a whole kind of world of it as well when it comes to agronomy and farmers, and sort of it's known as integrated pest management as well. So looking at a whole ecosystem as a whole and what is a pest in that, and how do you then try and encourage things that will be predating those pests, and trying to do it in a way that makes more ecological sense than just spraying, because obviously that's what's happened in the recent past and it's got us to a bad place. So yes, trying to think about things as a system is definitely the way forward, I think. But there's going to be bumps on the road, I'm sure, for anyone starting out doing that. So yeah.
Right, brilliant. Well, I think that was the last question. So have you got anything else you'd like to say, Anna, or is that
No, other than thank you so much for coming along and watching the talk. Yeah, and I hope that the match didn't cause too much disturbance as well. I got a bit distracted at one point when there was lots of shouting.
Yeah, it was brilliant. Thank you.
But yeah, I don't know if you wanted to share my email address, then I'm happy for you to do that if people had other questions and whatever.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you again, Anna. It really was really interesting. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. If you've enjoyed this talk and would like to make a donation towards our work, then please do visit our website under the donation section. But once again, thank you for all of your support and for joining us this evening, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And good night. Goodbye, everybody.